Hello, I'm excited today to talk about Chapter 2 of Approaches and Methods in Language Teaching by Professor Richards and Dr. Rodgers. So last time we looked at a brief history of language teaching, Chapter 1, and today in Chapter 2 we're going to talk about the nature of approaches and methods in language teaching. And in future videos we'll look at the rest of the chapters, which look at individual methods. Okay. So specifically in Chapter 2 we're going to look at approaches versus methods, what an approach is, the theory of language, the theory of language learning, design, objectives, the syllabus, types of learning and teaching activities, learner roles, teacher roles, the role of instructional materials, procedure, method, and conclusion. So in an effort to provide some structure to English language teaching, in 1963, Edward Anthony established a language teaching hierarchy as follows: approach, method, and technique. Specifically, according to him, an approach was axiomatic, and a method procedural, and a technique implementational. Meaning, your approach as a teacher dealt with the nature of language teaching and learning, and specifically what you would be teaching. And your method would be your plan for presenting the material. And your technique would be what you actually did in each lesson. So you could say your approach would be your curriculum, your method would be your syllabus, and your technique would be your lesson plans. But in 1986, Richards and Rodgers, the authors of this book that we're talking about, modified Anthony's hierarchy. So instead of approach, method, and technique, they came up with approach, design, and procedure. Okay, but it's not exactly a hierarchy. So you have a method, and that comprises an approach, a design, and a procedure. So that's what we're going to look at today. So first of all, they define approach as something that refers to theories about the nature of language and language learning that serve as the source of practices and principles in language teaching. So the difference between the nature of language and the nature of language learning is significant. So we're going to look at that in detail as well today. So first of all, the theory of language. What is language? There are three main views: structural, functional, and interactional. The structural view of language is the most traditional. It's the view that language is a system of related elements, basically being defined in terms of phonological units, grammatical units, and lexical items. It's how language is built or constructed. And examples of methods based on this view would include the audiolingual method, total physical response, and the silent way. The functional view of language is that language is a vehicle for the expression of functional meaning, and that communication and meaning are more important than grammar. So again, it's how something works or functions. And examples of methods based on this view would be communicative language teaching, the functional notional approach, and English for specific purposes. And then the third view is interactional, which sees language as a vehicle for the realization of interpersonal relations, social interactions, social relations. So this is more personal than the functional view. It's how language is used for interaction and conversation and what's known as ethnomethodology, how people make sense of their world. And then there's the theory of language learning, which answers one or both of the following questions. The first question is about psycholinguistic and cognitive processes, and the second is about conditions. So specifically, one, what are the psycholinguistic cognitive processes involved in language learning? What goes on up here? And two, what are the conditions that need to be met in order for these learning processes to be activated? What goes on out here? So again, you have cognitive and conditions. Process-oriented theories build on habit formation, induction, inferencing, hypothesis testing, and generalization. That's cognitive. And condition-oriented theories emphasize the nature of the human and physical context in which language learning takes place. So some examples of methods that come from the theory of language learning include Krashen's monitor model, Terrell's natural approach, Curran's counseling learning, Gattegno's silent way, and Asher's total physical response. So specifically, just a quick review of those methods, a quick look at them. According to Krashen, there's a distinction between the acquisition of language as a child and the learning of language as an adult. So practical learning versus academic learning or studying. And Terrell's natural approach was based on both processes and conditions. And then Curran's counseling learning and Gattegno's silent way focus mainly on the conditions held to be necessary for learning to take place without specifying what the processes are. So an example of a condition necessary for successful learning would be the atmosphere of the classroom, meaning one that helps students feel confident instead of fearful. All right, and next, Asher's total physical response, speech and action. This addresses both the process and conditions of learning, specifically that adult learners should learn languages like children do by coordinating language with action. So teachers who have the same approach will not necessarily have the same procedure for actually teaching their learners. In other words, theory does not dictate a particular set of teaching techniques and activities. Next is design, which basically is your syllabus and includes your objectives, the content you're going to teach, your activities, and the roles of learners, teachers, and materials. So your objectives can be process-oriented or product-oriented. Product-oriented objectives focus on grammar, lexis, pronunciation, and accuracy, whereas process-oriented objectives focus on learning to learn and communicate. So Gategno believed that learning is not seen as the means of accumulating knowledge, but as the means of becoming a more proficient learner. He said, I don't teach, I let them learn. Next, we have the syllabus. A syllabus can be based on subject matter, what to talk about for something such as English for specific purposes, or linguistic matter, how to talk about it for situational language teaching or the audiolingual method. And of course, the content of the syllabus should be based on learners' needs. So maybe you have a grammar-based course, which would involve the sequencing and gradation of grammar based on the difficulty or frequency of the items. Or maybe you would design a communicative or functionally oriented course in which the sequencing would be based on the learner's communicative needs. So for example, in counseling learning, there is no syllabus as the students choose the topics for themselves. And generally speaking, you can have an a priori or a posteriori syllabus. Normally, it's the former, an a priori syllabus. Priori, as in prior, before, that syllabus would be prepared before the course that you would teach. A posteriori, post meaning after, meaning your syllabus would be prepared after you taught the course based on what actually happened. Okay. So it's knowledge being obtained through experience or knowledge obtained by analyzing ideas, not experience. And then if we look at the silent way, which uses colored rods and doesn't involve, as the name implies, a lot of teaching, a lot of talking on the part of the teacher, and TPR, total physical response, syllabuses for those courses focus on grammar and accuracy. So now we're going to move on to types of learning and teaching activities. So you need to consider whether you're focusing on the product or the process. Product-focused courses put more importance on learning lexis and achieving grammar and pronunciation accuracy than process-oriented courses do. And you would need to consider the instructional process and the interaction of teachers, learners, and materials, how everything goes together. Next would be learner roles. How are learners regarded? Your method should address your activities, the degree of control learners have, grouping patterns, learners working together, and whether learners are viewed as processors, performers, initiators, or problem solvers. So, for example, audiolingualism was criticized for the following reasons. There was a very limited role on the part of the learners. they were viewed as stimulus response mechanisms, the students, that is, and there was a lot of repetitive practice. So in order to update teaching methods, more regard for learners and learning styles was shown. For example, in 1976, Johnson and Paulson promoted learner autonomy, the idea that learners should evaluate themselves, that learner interaction promotes learning, that peer tutoring should be utilized, and that students can learn not just from the teacher, but other students and from the materials or any other sources. And now teacher roles. So it's important to recognize that your beliefs or your boss's beliefs or the administration's beliefs about language and learning will define the teacher's role, which will define the learner's roles. They're all connected. So regarding teacher roles, a method should look at the following. 1, teacher functions. 2, how much control the teacher has over the learning. 3, teacher autonomy regarding the content of the syllabus. And 4, the interaction patterns. So, for example, does the teacher take on an asymmetrical relationship with their learners? For example, it would be similar to the relationship a conductor would have with an orchestra, or a therapist with a patient, or a coach to players. Or does the teacher have a symmetrical relationship with the learners, like what you have with friends, colleagues, and teammates? Next, your method will determine where on the dependency spectrum the learners are, from controlled to free. So are your lessons lecture type lessons, or are they more collaborative learning, problem-based or project-based, or somewhere in the middle? Regarding interaction patterns, are the seats arranged in rows and columns in the traditional method, or are they arranged in a way that's more egalitarian and conducive to monitoring and interaction? The only time I have my students sit in rows and columns is when they're taking a written test. Otherwise, they're sitting with the chairs arranged in a U shape or in small groups. So if you consider the audio-lingual method and the silent way, the audio-lingual method is very teacher-centered, with students just repeating after the teacher like parrots. So the teacher's doing a lot of the talking, whereas with the silent way, as the name implies, the teacher is not doing a lot of talking. And next, you have the role of instructional materials. So the objectives, the content in the syllabus, the activities, and the roles of the teacher and students will determine the role of the materials. So the main goals of materials are the presentation of the content, to help students practice the content, to help students communicate using the content, and to help students develop learner autonomy. And some things to consider are the types of materials. Are they teacher-centered or learner-centered? And do they involve using real material or not? real language, the level of the teacher's command of English, whether the material can replace the teacher altogether, and the interaction patterns that will be necessary. And if we consider the form of materials, the relation of materials to other input, and the ability of teachers, all right, we would have to consider whether we're using a textbook, audio visuals, computer software, some combination thereof, none of the above, and that would depend on what your school or department provided, any other aspects of your teaching context might influence that. And then hopefully the materials you're using somehow relate to the other input that's taking place. Everything should be cohesive and organized and scaffolded. And the ability of teachers. What is the teacher's language competence? Native speaker, non-native speaker, what training have they had, and how much experience do they have? All of these things affect what material a teacher can use and how effectively they can do so. And finally, procedure. This is the last level. This is about the actual moment-to-moment techniques, practices, and behaviors that take place during a lesson. How are the tasks and activities used in the actual lessons, and how do they affect teaching and learning, the teaching and learning that takes place? And there are three dimensions to your procedure. The presentation of the material, practicing the material, and feedback on the student's performance. So again, today we're talking about Richards and Rodgers' breakdown of a method, which consists of an approach, a design, and a procedure. And an approach can be based on your theory of the nature of language and or your theory of the nature of language learning. And your design will include your objectives, syllabus, activities, and the roles of the learners, teacher, and materials. And your procedure is what actually takes place during each lesson. The use of time and space and equipment and interaction patterns and tactics and strategies. So in conclusion, the approach, design, and procedure system can be used to analyze any ELT method or other language teaching method, even though most methods are not described in such terms. Furthermore, there is not necessarily a clear transition from approach to design to procedure in any given method. It's not a hierarchy the way Edward Anthony laid it out, according to Richards and Rodgers. Methods can be created anywhere along the spectrum. So in thinking about this, I thought of a bowl of spaghetti and meatballs. It doesn't really matter what you put in first, second, or last. The spaghetti sauce or meatballs, when you mix it up, it doesn't make a difference. So whether you start with your approach, design, or procedure, and move on to your design or procedure or approach, and finish with your procedure, approach, or design, it doesn't really matter. In the end, you have your method that hopefully works for you and your learners, and it's something that you will probably change in different ways throughout your career. So here are some questions to think about with your colleagues or classmates, or you can leave comments or questions below. Number one, what do you think of Richards and Rodgers' breakdown of methods, approaches, designs, and procedures? Number two, what are your views regarding the theory of language versus the theory of language learning, and how does that inform your teaching? 3, how do you develop your curriculum, syllabuses, lesson plans, material, and activities? And 4, what are your views on the roles of teachers, learners, and materials? Thanks for watching, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. Have a great day.